We are back, and we are joined once again by my friend of the show, Joshua Cohen, Ettingermentum of the Ettingermentum Newsletter. Josh, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So we're a little despondent, obviously.
Mm,
You, as well as myself, were pretty bullish on the idea that these aggregators were overestimating this Trump support, and turns out they were right. They were right.
yeah,
I mean, maybe by accident, but they were right. And these highly rated pollsters like J.N. Seltzer was like wrong by 17 points.
yeah, 20 points. Yeah, it's a historic first. It's like just like to get into like the predictions thing. I tried my kind of philosophy was to look specifically at the indicators that had proven to be reliable during the Trump era. I was like really trying to see. I was always very open to the idea of there being a non-response bias that benefited Trump. Like I kind of I was well, I had always said in my writing that I thought that it was more because of the pandemic, but Nate Cohn had always said that they were still having issues with non-response and that it was still an ongoing problem. I thought the pandemic was a more compelling reason because there wasn't a non-response issue in 2016.
Right.
But I was looking at all these like indicators to see like is like the Trump support here real, or like is he like on track to win? Are like is there, or the like the pollsters were saying they always had it at a very close stagnant race. I wanted to see if like the indicators that had previously shown that the polls would be off, like the Washington primary or things like the Seltzer poll, both of which were accurate both 2016 and 2020 when the polls were very very off in 2020. And it gave me like a feeling that like, well, the warning signs that existed these 2 years that were indicated through these very high quality pollsters, these pollsters who weren't afraid to hedge or move in one direction because it's what the consensus was or what the narratives were, they were all kind of pointing this one way. What happened was is that like for because I think changes in the media environment, changes in how like kind of what Nate Cohn at the New York Times said, these indicators that were accurate up to as late as 2020 were like not really reflecting shifts in the environment. He had kind of made a very strong case that this was the case for special elections, which throughout 2023 and 2024 showed very strong, like a very strong baseline for Democrats. Senate polling always showed them doing very well, and I took that as kind of evidence that generic, like after 2022, when Democrats have the best midterm results since the Great Depression for an incumbent party, the story seemed clear to me that people wanted to vote for a Democrat. They weren't really enthused with Trump. Trump was always unpopular, disliked. His presidency like ended with him being kicked out of office. Um, but the Biden administration just was not acceptable to them. They weren't willing to accept like this administration led by this very, very old man who wasn't seen as a capable leader, who they thought presided over crisis and inflation, and they just that seemed to be a coherent story. So I spent like a year through most of 2023 up until he left the race getting increasingly pessimistic. I initially thought that he could perform at about the same level that he did, that there was a chance his approval rating might improve or he could be a something of like a capable candidate. Even I was always very down on him. My first ever article of the race was saying that he shouldn't run for re-election. And up until July, I was like, thought if he doesn't leave the race, Trump is going to win. This is just not tenable. Even going into the debate, I thought there was a possibility that the debate could work for him. But I was like, I was a crisis moment. With Kamala, I had always been very skeptical of her. I had only like supported her as replacing him as a nominee because I had gotten so down on Biden after the special counsel report came out when he couldn't remember like how to spell Afghanistan. I thought that was like a really devastating thing, and that it showed that like it just was not tenable. You had polls like 75, 80% of people thought he was too old to serve as president, including many Democrats. And like So I thought that when Harris came in, thought that like she had a very uphill battle. Then she sees this initial surge, and my telling of it is, oh, this is just like I don't like. I'm not too impressed by her personally. I'm not. I don't think she has a great electoral record. I don't think she's really impressed in office. I didn't want her to be the VP in 2020, but maybe people just want to see the generic Democrat they wanted to vote for in her. And part of being a generic Democrat is being separate from the Biden administration. And as the campaign went on past the first 2 weeks, she just didn't do that. She didn't break from him on meaningfully on the issues. She only moved to his right when she did. She
Can I pause
adopted this.
there,
Yeah,
Josh, just to flesh out that part? So how much does this fall on the feet of Jen O'Malley Dillon, the campaign manager that Harris retained from Biden? You know, the
yeah,
perception of Harris being too liberal was consistent throughout the race, despite all of these appeals to Republicans and to moderate voters. And for me, some of that is just California woman,
yeah,
black, and there's not much you can do about it. But perhaps if that had been a different black woman from California who
yeah,
wasn't the VP in this Biden administration, who also wasn't using his entire campaign team, who has a very specific idea about what messaging should be out there, maybe that could have been a different story.
yeah. Well, I mean, the people talk about like the ideology thing. But it was the polling there was, and maybe the polling was off. We like even with all the changes the pollsters did make, they did consistently underestimate Republicans. Like according to compared to the averages, it was by a lot less in the states that were the most important compared to 2016 and 2020. But in states that weren't competitive, where they were maybe not hurting, like you said, maybe getting it right by accident, or they weren't hurting to a close number, and they were comfortable putting her up at like 15 and New Jersey or Illinois, and then she only wins those states by 5 points or 8 points. Uh, uh, like the polls, like still like got things off here. There was still like clearly uh, this group of support for Trump that was not being picked up by
So
what
shy
they were
Trump
doing.
support. Like
Yeah,
we both were basically like, I think, you know, subscribe to the idea that this shy Trump support was being overestimated, and it
yeah,
wasn't. It actually may
yeah,
have been underestimated. And you also had a great piece like 2 weeks ago about how the death of the never Trump, or the Trumpism without Trump, and how you talked about how Trump's actually maybe more popular than all of these generic Republicans that have adopted his whole, or what they have grafted on these
yeah,
Reaganite conservatives. Your piece, I mean, I'm paraphrasing it for the audience, but I just think it's such a great point. Like, Trump came out of that primary in 2016 being viewed as one of the more moderate candidates in
nominees.
the
Yeah,
Republican primary. Then he wins, he delivers for the evangelicals with Roe, and he is extreme in many ways. And so all of the folks that wanted like this nationalistic right-wing politics grafted what their ideology was onto him and said,
yeah,
"Oh, this is redemption. We were right the whole
yeah.
time
This,
about
yeah,
right-wing populism." But no, we're in TV America.
hmm,
David Foster Wallace talked about this. Like, this is a television country. He's the television president. Like, despite his unfavorables, and maybe if people think he's distasteful, they may want him as president. And that may
yeah.
be just like the thing.
Yeah, it's he like there is his favorables. The like the Harris people constantly talked about how her favorables were worse. His favorables were a lot worse than hers were, which never really
Or
seemed to amount to
walls.
a big gap
Yeah.
in the polling. Um, but that like the way that just like they're perceived is that Harris is somebody can personally like maybe or think is like kind of affable or not like a bad person. People generally did think she was smart. That was one thing that was consistently seen in polling, but not see as a serious, experienced leader. While Trump sort of has like this bad cop, dirty Harry effect, where people who dislike him will go out of their way to kind of see him as a strong leader due to the fact that they dislike him because of this cultural archetype of, oh, he's like a bad cop and a loose cannon and he doesn't play by the rules, but he gets things done. So it's like perversely, by being more dislikable and being like more of like an abrasive personality, he makes himself come across as a strong leader. And that was something that he consistently registered in polling. And we saw like there was like how polling suggested Trump did better than practically every Republican Senate candidate besides one. Only Larry Hogan outran him. Every other Senate candidate for the Republicans and state like in North Carolina, their statewide candidates, there was a group of people who were voting for Democrats for U.S. Senate, for governor in North Carolina, but who also voted for Trump because, like, against the ballot on Trump, uh, on the ballot against Trump was a member of the Biden administration and not a more generic Democrat. We're probably going to end. We are going to see Democrats win in Wisconsin and Michigan and probably Arizona, maybe Nevada. At the same time, Harris is losing all these states. The and like that plus North Carolina, where they won like a bunch of statewide races. They won the governorship, the attorney generalship. Those states together, like, even if you give Trump Pennsylvania and Nevada, where it's up in the air if Democrats will even win a seat in those two states. Those states, if they had voted for Harris, if she had won over those voters who voted for a Democrat down ballot and for Trump on the top of the ticket, she would have gotten the 270 electoral votes. The majority of voters, the electoral college majority of voters in these swing states that we saw in 2022 was there in this election. Even with the electorate, with all these like new demographics and all these shifts towards Trump, there was still a demographic of people out there. There was still enough people out there willing to vote for Democrats that it could have delivered them a victory, even in light of everything that's happened over the past 4 years and like how whatever strengths Trump may have. But she just couldn't get those people who were voting for Democrats in races. Otherwise, she also, like House candidates, I think, in swing districts regularly outperformed her. She couldn't get those people on her side. And the best explanation for that is just her connection to the Biden administration. It seems realistic enough to me that if they ran somebody who was a strong, credible candidate who was disconnected from the Biden administration, maybe not her, maybe her if she made bigger moves to separate herself, she could have reached that appeal that these candidates like Tammy Baldwin, like it's not even about ideology. You have Tammy Baldwin, who's a progressive in Wisconsin, who outran her and won her race. You have Alyssa Slotkin, who's a centrist former CIA officer in Michigan, who is probably going to win her race. Josh Stein in North Carolina, granted he had a very easy opponent. He's a moderate. Ruben Gallego will probably win in Arizona. Some have called that race for him. He was a former progressive who moved to the center. It wasn't like people are going to make this like a centrism versus progressive thing. And I think that like the centrists have a lot to answer for here, like personally, but I'm not of the belief that like a particular set of policies would have moved the race in one direction or the other. This isn't a question of ideology. It's a question of leadership. It's a question of, are you seen as a competent person? Like fundamentally, like beyond all the stuff about like what these people represent ideologically and like with like the colors on the map, people want somebody who they think can do the job. And with Trump, who had positive retrospective approvals in some polling, who was seen as somebody who they give him a mulligan for COVID, ran a good economy, he was just seen as a more credible person than an inexperienced relative, like seen as a lightweight vice president. And he was able to win people who otherwise voted for Democrats.
And I'm sorry, but there is a gap in like if she's viewed favorably but not viewed as a leader. That's also
Yeah,
about being a woman. Like, I mean, that's also
yeah.
part of it.
That's true. And I don't think that we should be afraid to like say that's the case just because she made decisions that we don't like. There's a
Exactly.
middle ground. You don't want to be like somebody saying that she only lost because of sexism or racism. That was like the sole reason. Because it wasn't. She made mistakes. Like Hassan said in the stream last night, she's a 60-year-old woman. When I wrote kind of my article explaining why, like providing a pre-election case and why Democrats could lose, I focused it mostly on Biden instead of her because I thought it wouldn't be like super fair to pile too much blame on somebody who had to come in at the last minute. But like she had control over this. She could have chosen to get a new staff if she wanted. She had control over what her messaging was. She had
Yeah.
control over her like staffing and personnel. and she chose to be as least risk averse as possible. She played like she was protecting a lead when it appears that she never really had one.
Yep, that's I think exactly right. And at the end of the day, I still bring this back to Biden, where
Yeah,
we
it
could have
all
had a
goes back
prime.
to him.
I
Yeah,
mean, it was his stubborn refusal to stay in the race with extremely low favorables, being 80 fucking 1.
yeah,
And there was no scenario where this jungle primary at the convention would have worked.
yeah,
Like the other options that you talk about, like the other stronger candidates than Harris, they would have had no legitimacy in my view if they were inserted in that way. And so at the end of the day, it comes back to Biden. It comes back to
yeah,
his decision because once he was unable to do the job, the only option was Harris. And she still had those ties to the administration. And we're seeing a broad anti-incumbency reaction in the West, in Europe, and in the United States. What's your view of that as it relates to the anti-incumbency post-COVID and the inflation that people felt? That's
yeah.
something that's happening across Europe and the United States.
Yeah, I would say that's an important point. It's a big reason for why, and you can't say it's particularly ideological. People are talking about the results as proof of like this big right wing shift in people's attitudes, and obviously there is like they have been successful at like winning over public opinion on on a lot of their issues. Like immigration has very right wing attitudes. I would say with an assist from how Democrats messaged on it. But like this is fundamentally, it's a question of material conditions first, where Biden is perceived as like presiding over this time of crisis, and then coming from that, it's just perceptions of leadership. It's you just can't have an 80-year-old president who can't message, has been in Washington since the Nixon administration, he was there to like vote on like the Watergate impeachment if it happened. Like
He
that's
was
how
one
long.
of Jimmy
Yeah.
Carter's early endorsers.
Yeah, in 1976, he like after his wife died, he got a phone call from the sitting president Nixon. Like he's just a complete fossil. He plays into like the worst perceptions of the Democratic Party, uh, and it's you. I think nominating him in 2020 was the fundamental mistake. I know that he was the best polling candidate, but like the more I look back on this, and the more I look back on like how much like brief enthusiasm there was for like the early Kamala entry into the race, how that like boosted her numbers. I feel like somebody younger, like in 2020, who maybe like might have had a similar appeal, like James Carville, I think was the only person on the planet who endorsed Michael Bennett in the primary because he saw him as like a possible avatar for that. And looking back on it, I think like we would have been in a better position if we had somebody who would look like a credible figure through this time of crisis. Like you can have, I think you can go through struggles as a leader, and you can have like be kind of inept like communicating, but doing both is just devastating. And they were never able to get out of their hole. And like he's had negative approval ratings since 2021. They haven't really even come all that close to being positive at any point. And what's really like kind of disturbing about this for me is that you see all these decisions. It'd be one thing if it was kind of up in the air if he was a viable candidate or not, and like you could reasonably disagree. But like the big argument that they said at the time in the reporting was that he was really like he made his decision to run for a new term because of the 2022 midterms. That was seen by him and the party as a vindication of his administration. But that was
Of
a
his
big
moderate position on abortion. Was one of the
yeah,
quotes.
things like that. That's what the Franklin
Because he
Foer
finds
book
abortion
said.
icky. Yeah, right.
Mhm. Things like that. So you had him like taking this as a personal vindication, where if you followed these races at the time, you had Democrats like Raphael Warnock in my state. I remember watching the debate. They asked him if he would support Biden running for a second term, and he refused to answer the question. It was accepted. Like Biden was never allowed to campaign anywhere outside of Maryland for the gubernatorial candidate that year. He was just like a pariah. There was not a single candidate in the country who was trying to run on his administration. They couldn't get as far away from him as they could, and they win like I think very clearly in spite of his unpopularity. And then you see this, like, the idea of the party is not that we can win in spite of Biden. They take it as we can win because of Biden. We're winning because of him. And it's just, you're not coming to that conclusion for any reason other than sentimentality. You're like, they're putting feelings over what the actual, like, hard decisions that need to be done. And it's a big breaking of the covenant that the centrist faction has always had with their voters ever since they become dominant within the party. Their promise has always been, we are the ones who take elections seriously. We will not be afraid to sacrifice or jettison any priority, we will slaughter every sacred cow. We will like make any tough decision if it helps for winning, because we understand how important this is. And when it comes to policy, there is not a single policy in the world they won't throw overboard if it gives them the slightest chance of winning. We saw they completely gave up on any affirmative messaging on immigration, even though the exit polls this year showed that like people supported a pathway to citizenship over mass deportations. The Fox poll said that. That was without the messaging from them on like making that point. Like, they were willing to totally surrender and throw countless people under the bus on the smallest chance that it could possibly increase their rating on a single issue. But when it comes to like giving up on this old man, not even like giving up an ideology, not even like saying you have to stop being centrist and you have to like go on your knees and become a progressive and adopt all my positions. It's like you can keep all of your like positions that you've always had. You just like have to do it by running a Gretchen Whitmer or someone instead of this like 80-year-old man. They refused to even consider that because they personally liked him. They thought he was a successful president. They thought he deserved to be more popular than he actually
I'm sorry,
was.
but as you say, it's not even ideological because, frankly, Bernie Sanders was a huge like advocate for him staying in the race. He was one of the last people to say that because of the fact that, yes, Biden delivered on some progressive priorities domestically. I mean, I think we'll not know for a while what the effect of the genocide in Gaza and his full-throated support for that has had on this election. You know, directly electorally, it may not have like a direct line, but it just contributes to what you're saying about this lack of faith in his leadership and then by extension Harris. And you know, it's just astonishing in that way.
The willingness to make any material concessions while refusing to compromise on these purely emotional things. These weren't like things that even matter for their worldview. It's purely emotional. It's in 2016, the Hillary Clinton campaign refused to manage, like, she was the second least popular candidate in terms of favorability ratings at the time. She was only behind Donald Trump that same year, but her campaign refused to really like even deal with the concept that she could be unpopular because they thought she deserved to be popular. They thought she was such a great person and such a smart, capable leader that, well, she should be popular. And if people don't think that they don't agree with that, then they have to be wrong. Like, they just weren't willing to admit reality when it wasn't what they wanted. When Biden is like, I would say, like at the time, I like said it very early on that I thought he clearly was not a capable candidate. That nothing in the 22 results and nothing about like his struggles made it look like he could make a comeback because it was so clearly linked to his age. It was so clearly unique to him and not the party as a whole. And that bore fruit when you saw every Senate candidate outrun Harris today. It just like there was.
What do you make of the clear difference in like crowd size and the spending that the Democrats did, like in ways that, you know, it on its face, I go, okay, this is an improvement from Hillary 2016. She went to Michigan, to Pennsylvania, to Wisconsin a bunch of times. She went to Arizona. She went to North Carolina. Like, this was a campaign that was trying to correct those particular mistakes. They outraised Trump by even wider margins than Hillary, I think, in 2016. None of it mattered. The ground game didn't matter. Like Elon Musk.
I was always skeptical of that because I just remember how much people were saying like it was going to win like Florida for Hillary in 2016. But yeah.
But like Elon Musk getting Trump outsourcing his ground operation, like. This is a reckoning, I think, with how we conceive of elections. Maybe like
well,
this is information warfare in spaces where the Democrats aren't even competitive.
Yeah, well, it's not totally. I wouldn't say that the fact that like they won despite having a better ground game, worse ground game, that was the case in 2016. Trump's campaign in 2016 was notoriously shambolic. I remember there's a story about how like in one of the most important swing counties in Colorado, there was a 16-year-old running his the county operation there. Like Bill Mitchell famously said, the ground game is in our hearts. So like it's not new that like this like massive organizational advantage by the Democratic Party isn't capable of bringing them over the line when their candidate just isn't compelling to people. And it goes against like a lot of like what kind of like the reasons they gave for why they underperformed in 2020. Like they said that that was because they were all at home because of COVID while Republicans were knocking on doors. It doesn't appear like it made a huge difference. And like with these, it could have made a difference maybe if it was a midterm, but and I think clearly what the case is now at these higher turnout elections, you are getting these very disengaged voters who the party just is not really capable of reaching with their messaging now. They had a very elitist DC kind of perspective towards the campaign. They were very like they stuck towards much of Biden's positions. They didn't make many populist appeals beyond kind of they had the thing about price caps, and that supposedly polled very well. But everything else was just kind of appealing to this like niche circle. The stuff with like never Trump Republicans and Liz Cheney. Like the only people who really were aware and care about that are people who are deeply connected to politics. And those people go to rallies and they donate and they maybe volunteer and sign up and help like knock on doors, but they're not, they only have one vote. There's like people who don't follow elections until like the final day and then go out and vote for Trump because they remember like the economy being good under him. They have as many votes as he does. If the fundamentals of the election and like the way that you're presenting yourself aren't in your favor, like you're not going to be able to win over these like disengaged voters. And it's the what makes it such a spectacular shift is that Obama in 2012, in 2008, he was the one who was winning over these disengaged voters, the low information people who like didn't follow the campaign closely. It was the Republicans who had like the most engaged and active and educated people, and they like were outpolled in the polling because of it. Like Obama outran his polls by 4 points nationally. Uh, there is clearly a really big issue with how Democrats like approach these people. Like it's talked about like it's a huge reckoning for the left, but like the fortunate thing is, and what gives us like some degree of a path forward, is that like our strategy, like the idea that we could, it actually is in a sense a vindication of kind of not just the like the Bernie strategy and this conception of politics actually dating back to Obama, where you don't just play politics by reacting to what's immediately in front of you and trying to focus group and manage everything as it comes, but by trying to reach out to people who aren't engaged in the elections, people who aren't following it, trying to shape the terrain to your advantage, trying to change the way people think of the issues, trying to change what the turnout and demographics are. When Democrats were doing that in 2008 with Obama, it was a big risk relative to their past campaigns. But what ended up happening was that they ended up registering hundreds of thousands of people. They got massive voter registration advantages in the lead up to those elections. They turned out a lot of people who had never voted before, and they created a pretty durable coalition around Obama. With Clinton and Biden and Harris, you have these campaigns that are very reactive to the political situation as it is and not trying to change it into something that it maybe could be, which was the idea behind the Sanders campaign. And it, given how reactive people were to this kind of Trump campaign that just acknowledged and reached out to these people, like took a proactive stance towards changing the way like the electorate was and the way people thought about politics, like their policies are pretty shitty. Like they're not all that popular. He's not all that popular in a way that someone like Bernie might have been. So looking at this, you kind of can get some hope that like this does show that like, and I know people said this after 2016 and it's supposedly been discredited now because like they like made hints towards like more left-wing populist policies after then, but like they ended up nominating Biden, they ended up nominating Harris, like for all of the talk about how like progressivism is totally exhausted and how it's been decisively repudiated, like it was only progressivism and like through the very insincere like mouthpiece of these like really like insular, inexperienced, in Harris's case, are unpopular or elitist figures like Biden. So it does like kind of show that politics is more malleable than it is otherwise, and that if you come out and you are like more true to yourself, you like have some degree of integrity instead of flip-flopping on all your positions, you try to meet people where they are instead of playing for cable news, you can change things fundamentally in a way that really benefits you, because the Republicans with like Trump with these very disengaged voters ended up doing that. It was the people like to kind of that were capable of like really changing the way things were. And I wouldn't say this is too overwhelming. Again, this is the same electorate that a lot of Democrats still won seats in swing states, but it just, and like if it wasn't for like the like Biden running and the economy being terrible, they probably wouldn't have had an inroad here. But they were still able to like realign things in a fundamental way that the Harris campaign never tried to.
Yeah, that's really well said. We mentioned earlier the exit polling with Latino voters.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.